Hello, this is Dr. Pearl with your second lecture. This one is a continuation of the French Revolution, so sort of a part two on the French Revolution. If you recall from the last lecture, we got up to the failure of the constitutional monarchy. Constitutional monarchy is going to fail for a number of reasons, one of the most important being the king's inability to adjust to a constitutional role. It's going to prove to be very difficult to go from absolutism to constitutionalism. There were other issues too, such as the conflict over religious practice. What should be the role of the Catholic Church in French society? That's going to prove to be very divisive. And of course, war. War, which is eventually going to spread between France and the rest of Europe, essentially, is going to radicalize the revolution because there are several times when it looks like the revolution itself might, in fact, collapse if foreign invaders enter into French soil and restore the king to absolutist rule. And so we got to the point where in September of 1792, you had the brutal September massacres, where over 1,000 so-called monarchist supporters are going to be executed, murdered, essentially, is what we have to call it. And we also have the arrest of the king. As it turns out, if you remember, September is also the moment in where France wins a victory against the Austrians and Prussians, thus saving the revolution. That doesn't mean the war is going to end, but the victory at Valmy in September of 1792 meant the revolution was not going to be crushed as immediately as it had seemed. Then, in September 1792, a very busy month, you also have the establishment of the French Republic. Now, again, what's a republic? A republic is simply stating that there is no monarch. It doesn't necessarily mean whether it's a free and democratic society, whether it's a dictatorship. You can't tell just when you hear the word republic. And one of the issues is going to be, what sort of republic will France have? Well, one of the things that's going to emerge is that you begin to have what you might call political factions. Now, you might expect instead of the word factions to hear me say something like political party. But I don't want to use the term party because that takes on all sorts of modern nuances that, we think of the modern Republican Party or Democratic Party or the Libertarian Party or the Green Party. It makes it sound like, oh, they're fundraising, there's a party platform, there's a structure, there are primaries. None of that's true here. The more old-fashioned term, faction, seems to work better. It's more realistic in terms of describing what's going to go on. The faction, the group of men who are going to dominate the early French Republic, the first stage of this republic, or what we call the Girondin faction. These men got their name. You might wonder, how do you get a name? How did the Republican Party become the Republican Party? Well, how did the Girondins get the name Girondin? For the simple fact that a number of the members of this faction came from the region of the Gironde in southwest France. So it's as simple as that. They weren't all from there, but that's where the name comes from. Two of the early leaders, most important leaders of this faction, were Jacques Brissot, who you see on the left, and Jean-Marie Roland. They shared certain issues in common. We'll talk about some of those issues. For the most part, they were moderate Republicans who did believe in a somewhat limited franchise. Franchise is another term for the vote. If you remember in the last lecture, there was a distinction between active and passive citizens. Active citizens paid a certain amount of taxes and therefore had the full rights of voting, holding office. Passive ones did not. The Girondins were not all that uncomfortable with that. The Jacobins, who we'll see in a moment, are going to disagree. The Girondins, the more moderate of the factions, are going to be faced by another faction that we know as the Jacobins. The Jacobins, or sometimes they're referred to as the Mountain. I'll explain why they're the Mountain in a moment. The Jacobins got their name because in Paris they met in the former Jacobin monastery So simply the building where they met gave their faction the name. They tended to be far more radical than the Girondins. Now, in the National Assembly, here's where you had the National Assembly eventually, merges and becomes the National Convention. So what was originally the Estates General, then the National Assembly. At this point, we're going to just simply call it the National Convention, but it's the legislature. If you remember, the Constitution of 1791 established a one-house legislative body. A one-house legislative body. There would not be an upper house like a Senate, that sort of thing. So the National Convention was the body which met and decided the legislative issues of the day. You'll notice in red, the red is where the Jacobins sat. And actually, if you saw the room, you would see that the Jacobins were sitting on a higher sort of, almost like this sort of stage platform kind of thing. And so as a pun, they were called the Mountain. And that's what in French they're labeled in here. That's how the Jacobins got their name, Mountain. On the right in blue, you had your Girondins. Now what's going to happen is, where they sat is going to lead to something which we live with to this day. Politically, we still talk about right, left, or center. If I say you're to my right, politically, I'm kind of saying I think you're more conservative than I am. If I say you're to the left, well, you're a bit more liberal or radical than I am. Or we could say, well, your politics are very much of the center. These are terms that are used around the world. They may mean different things. Left, right, and center in the Philippines is not the same thing as left, right, and center in Spain. Left, right, and center in Argentina is not the same as left, right, and center in Norway. Politics are different in different countries. But throughout the world, we still use the term left, right, and center. We do. In this country, very much so. It comes from this moment in the French Revolution, based on where people sat in the National Convention. One of the issues where the Jacobins and Girondins are going to differ is on the fate of the king. The Jacobins wanted his blood. See, remember when the Tuileries Palace was stormed? And there was that whole issue of finding documents which showed that the king was providing information for the Austrians where French defenses were weak. Well, this is going to lead to an outcry. It's how can you give them this information? So in the Jacobin eyes, he was a traitor. Now, the Girondins wanted the king removed. It's not that they were monarchists. They were not. They were republicans, meaning that they believed in a French republic, no king. But the Girondins did not want his blood. They did not want his blood. So what's essentially going to happen is they're all going to vote guilty on the charges against the king. There was essentially a unanimous vote. But when the vote was held as to his fate, it was a very close vote, but the Jacobins narrowly, voted for his execution. The Girondins had wanted him to be sent into exile. Kick him out, send him away, but we don't need his blood. The Jacobins won this vote, and essentially the king will be executed in early 1793. And on the left, you see a drawing, not a fine work of art at all, but it shows the moment of the execution of the king. There are a couple of people who are kind of odd in this drawing. I like the guy in the lower right-hand corner who's looking away. He's sort of like, I could do without being here today. I didn't need the overtime. And then the guy on the horse looks a bit like George Washington. He's not George Washington, by the way. Men still were wearing powdered wigs at the time, and it made them all kind of look the same. That style, powdered wigs, will begin to disappear as the Jacobins emerge triumphant. They were rather uncomfortable with that sort of fancy, sort of powdered wig look. So the king was executed. When he was executed on the guillotine, and I'll talk about the guillotine just in a moment, there was essentially a shock. It's almost like, there was support for this action for the most part. And then when it was done, though, it was almost a sense of horror. Like, I know we were talking about it, but gee, we really did it. There was sort of disgust once it was done. The fate of his wife, though, Marie Antoinette, is going to be rather different. She is shown on the right in a very famous drawing by Jacques-Louis David. David was the great artist of the French Revolution. You already saw one of his works. You saw his painting of, the tennis court oath. Well, this was a drawing he did of Marie Antoinette literally minutes before she was to be brought to be executed. This was several months after the death of her husband, her hands tied behind her back, and prematurely aged due to the misery of her life at this point. And when she was brought to the guillotine, there were shouts and screams of joy. Unlike with the king, where there was some revulsion, there was none of that shown towards the execution of Marie Antoinette. She was hated. And the basis of her hatred, I would emphasize, has to do with the fact that she was an Austrian princess at the time that, France was at war with Austria. So her Austrian roots played a role. But also, I think the fact that she was a woman. There was and still is a double standard in terms of how men and women are treated, judged. And so she was judged far more harshly than her husband. In fact, her treatment in the months prior to her execution was particularly brutal. You remember I showed you the building, the Conciergerie, in the previous lecture? The Conciergerie was where most of the murders in September of 1792 took place, because that's where they housed royalist prisoners. It's this old medieval structure. Well, if you go inside today, and it's open to visitors, you can go to the room where Marie Antoinette spent the last months of her life. And they basically recreated the room as it was. You see a wax figure of Marie Antoinette in the center on that chair. She's wearing the sort of nun's habit. She spent her last months primarily in meditative prayer. Cruelly, there's so many things that were cruel about this. You notice on the left, there is a guard standing behind a kind of some sort of barrier. She was not allowed to have any privacy. 24 hours a day, a soldier would be assigned to watch her. So that was just one insulting thing. Another terrible thing was her son was not allowed to be with her. Her son and daughter was not allowed to be with her. She had 2 surviving children at this point. And the son, who was only 8 years old at the time, was kept in a cell near her and at times given alcohol and then prompted to say terrible things about his mother, including charges of incest. None of those charges were true, but under the influence of alcohol, this little kid would say whatever he wanted. It's just another example of the cruelty of the French regime against the old royal family. Now, the Jacobins, the Jacobins and Girondins are going to differ on more than just the fate of the king and his wife. One place where they're going to differ is how should France be organized? What's going to happen is the French Revolution brought to an end the old system of French provinces. France used to be divided into a number of provinces of different sizes and shape. Normandy, for example, Provence, Burgundy. Instead, France was divided into roughly equal departments. And you see on this map here, the division of France into departments, a division that exists to this day. The question, though, was what would be the relationship of the departments to the central government? The Girondins wanted a weaker central government and additional powers in the departments. They wanted strong local government, more of a federalist style system. In the United States, we have a federalist system. We have an important central government based in Washington, D.C., but as you could see, the states play a major role in our lives, and New York City, for example, plays a major role in our lives. We in the United States follow the British model, which is more emphasis on local government in terms of handling issues such as education or policing. And that was more what the Girondins wanted. The Jacobins wanted a highly centralized France. They basically wanted Paris to run everything. All major and even minor decisions, for the most part, would emanate out of the capital city. That's going to prove to be a controversial issue. We're going to see later on that the Jacobins bring that about when they emerge triumphant. And later on, when we get to Napoleon, we're going to see that permanent shift to a highly centralized France, one that exists to this day. Another place where the Jacobins and Girondins are going to differ is on the central economic issue of the day, which was the terribly high inflation. Prices were going up, particularly on the most important item of subsistence, which was grain. Bread prices were going through the roof. The Girondins are going to maintain leave the price alone. They took a more classical liberal idea that don't interfere with the prices, laissez-faire, don't touch it. Eventually, supply and demand will meet, and you'll end up with the just price, the just or fair price. Leave it alone. Interfering with the marketplace is going to be problematic in their view. The Jacobins took a different point of view. It's not that they wanted to eliminate private property, by no means. They were not extremists on that point at all. But they did believe that if you let the grain prices, if you let it run free, the price will go beyond the means for most Frenchmen to pay for it, and ultimately people will starve. And so ultimately you have to have what they called a law of maximum. Law of maximum meaning the government should set a top price on grain and no one could sell the grain for anything above that. You'll notice, by the way, in this slide, there's a cartoon. The British are going to enter in the late 18th century a kind of golden age of political cartooning. And the British are going to have an interesting reaction to the French Revolution. Initially, when the French Revolution began, the British took a somewhat positive view of it, in part because what did the early stages of the French Revolution establish? A constitutional monarchy, like where? As in Great Britain. So initially there was general support for the revolution in Britain. As the revolution became more radicalized, violent, and by 1793, Britain joins in the coalition war against France, the British view of the revolution begins to turn. And the cartoons of the age tend to reflect that. In the image you see right here, on the left, you see a supporter of the French Revolution. And I could tell that because he's wearing the classic hat of supporters of the French Revolution at the time. And you'll notice he's eating grass, his clothes are in rags, and then ironically he's labeled as someone who is enjoying French liberty. On the right, you see someone who's supposed to represent Britain. You notice he's labeled as a British slave. Here's a man who is clearly well-fed, probably too well-fed, enjoying the classic British dish of roast beef. And so the cartoonist here is trying to ironically point out the French can talk about liberty all they want. Who's living better? The average Englishman is the point they're making there. But you know what? The Jacobin support for a law of maximum is going to be something very much that wins the heart and soul of an important group in France, but particularly a group in Paris, a group we could label as the sans-culottes. Sans-culottes is a term. The term essentially means sans without culottes. Culottes are stockings or leggings. Wealthy men at the time, nobles and the members of bourgeoisie would wear leggings, silk leggings. The sans-culottes were essentially working class people, working class in places like Paris or in the rest of the country, who could not afford the fancy silk leggings. What did they wear? They wore something that is closer to what you and I would call pants. Now, rather than being embarrassed over their inability to purchase the fancy culottes, they began to refer to themselves as sans-culottes and saw themselves as the bread and butter supporters of the French Revolution. We are what the revolution is all about. So these working class men and women sort of gel as a group, and they are increasingly supportive of the Jacobins. They support the Jacobins because the Jacobins wish to see an elimination of the distinction between active and passive citizens. They wanted all men to be considered, full-fledged active citizens. Also, as you recall just from a moment ago, the sans-culottes the Jacobins believed in capping the price of grain. And for the sans-culottes, this was a huge issue. Take your average working class Frenchman and his family. What's the big ticket item in their family budget? You would think as a modern New Yorker, it must be housing. No, it is the grain price. The price of their daily loaf was where most of their family budget was directed towards. And so for them, capping it was very appealing. Now, by the way, this painting here is a sort of idealized version of a sans-culotte, sort of a propaganda vision, So it's much more heroic and romantic, and the reality is quite different. But you'll notice this man is wearing what you and I would call pants, and therefore he is a sans-culotte. Now, by 1793, after several months of leadership by the Girondin faction, the revolution increasingly looked like it was in danger. All sorts of issues were arising, and increasingly the Jacobin leadership looked like they were increasingly the Girondin leadership, those who led this early republic, looked like they were unable to manage the functions of government. One of the biggest issues is going to be continuing inflation. And you can see on this slide that inflation was extremely high when the revolution began in 1789, began to go down, and in 1792, you do see for a time a rather significant dip, but at mid-year point, what do you begin to see again? Rise. And, the instability of prices creates a kind of a radicalized situation here. But that's not the only problem facing the Girondin leadership. They begin to face internal revolts. For example, in the Vendée region, you can see on the map that red area. In the Vendée region, you begin to have groups of peasants arming themselves against the central French government. What's the major issue for these peasants in the Vendée? Very often it centers around religious issues. If you remember, the French revolutionary governments had confiscated the lands of the church, took over many church buildings, and essentially made the French Catholic clergy civil servants of the state by requiring them to swear an oath to the French nation. Well, these peasants were in many cases very traditional in their religious beliefs. They saw the French government as essentially attacking God. And so they began to take up arms against the French state. So now the Girondin Republic not only has external enemies, the Austrians, the Prussians, the British, the Dutch, but now inside of France, Frenchman is fighting Frenchman. Well, they're going to try a number of ways of dealing with this. For one thing, they created this what was called a revolutionary tribunal, which is essentially going to be a court to kind of quickly render justice. In a time of emergency, we need to have a special court to deal with those who are a threat to French society. Of course, the problem is going to be the idea that revolutionary justice is not always fair justice. And often it was going to be justified that, well, we're in a difficult situation here. We have to act decisively. Whether we're acting correctly or not is not always the issue. That's going to be a very dangerous idea. And ultimately, the Girondins, who allowed for the creation of this revolutionary tribunal, this special revolutionary court, are going to be victimized by it when they ultimately fall and are then charged with treason. If you don't hold to the rules of law, of justice, if you don't hold to the way in which the courts are supposed to operate in a fair and unbiased manner, you could use it against your enemies, but you can't be shocked when your enemies eventually use it against you. There's going to be another situation where this comes up. The Girondins agreed to the creation within the National Convention of what was called the Committee of Public Safety. It was thought that the several hundred member National Convention was unwieldy. They'll continue to meet. The national legislature will meet, but we need to have specialized committees to really do the work that France needs. So they agreed to the creation of what was called the Committee of Public Safety. Initially, the Girondins are going to dominate this 9-man body, which in many ways becomes the key, the central decision-making body within France. But over time, the Jacobins are going to push them out, and the Jacobins are going to use the Committee of Public Safety to basically dominate the French state in their own vision. The Girondins are also going to be tainted with the charge of treason. It's unfair, perhaps, but they are going to be tainted with that. If you remember, you had the Battle of Valmy in September of 1792. General Daumier was the hero of the Battle of Valmy, and he was given the task of, after Valmy, pushing the Austrians out of what was, today we call it Belgium. Belgium did not exist at the time, but, at the time it was known as the Austrian Netherlands. The problem is going to be he meets with defeat. And he recognizes that because he's been defeated, if he goes back to France, he'll be charged as a traitor. It's unfair. He didn't do anything wrong. I mean, part of the problem was the government did not provide him with enough troops and equipment. There were a number of military reasons for his defeat. He was not personally a traitor. But he knew if he goes back to Paris, he's going to pay with his life. So after being defeated by the Austrians, he flees to the Austrian side to save his own life. Why does this taint the Girondins? Daumier was seen as a Girondin general, meaning that the Girondin leadership chose him as their commander. And so whatever he did, whether for good or bad, was seen as a reflection on the Girondins. So when he defected to the Austrians, essentially to save his life, they, the Girondin leadership in Paris, are going to be charged with the crimes that they would have been charged against Daumier. This all leads to an illegal insurrection. Insurrection is another another term for uprising. The Jacobins illegally, on May 31st of 1793, rise up with their supporters, the sans-culottes, these working class men and women in Paris. They rise up and seize the National Convention. They arrest those they arrest those Girondins they can get their hands on. Some Girondins do get away. And essentially, this event in May of 1793, excuse me, marks the end of the Girondin Republic and the beginning of the Jacobin Republic. Remember in the previous lecture, I provided you, there's a little chart that said, the moderate republic and then the radical republic. Well, the Girondin Republic was the moderate republic, and that comes to an end at the end of May. And now we begin the Jacobin, or much more radical republic. So our revolution has had another major transitional moment in the spring of 1793. I can't say that the Jacobin period, which lasts for a little over a year from 1793 into 1794, was a one-man dictatorship. That's not the case here. But the most influential Jacobin of this period, the man who wielded more influence than any other, was the man you see in this slide, Maximilien Robespierre. Robespierre was trained as a lawyer before the revolution. He attended the Estates General. Very early on, he began to embrace radical thought. Well before many others thought about getting rid of the king and establish a French republic, Robespierre had been supportive of such ideas. Robespierre had an interesting nickname. He was known as the Incorruptible, meaning that he could not be corrupted. And in that sense, it's true. The French Revolution is going to have many individuals who may in fact believe in the ideals of the revolution, but if they can make money on the side from the revolution, so much the better. So for example, let's say there was a contract to be provided to, for someone to produce uniforms for the French armies marching against the Austrians and the Prussians. Well, if you gave me a bribe, I'll make sure you get that contract. There was a lot of that going on. Robespierre never participated in anything like that. He lived very simply. He was, in many ways, incorruptible. That doesn't make him a good man, though. He was a fanatical believer in the radical French Revolution. So don't assume that because you're not seeking to make money from something, it makes you a good and moral individual. I can provide you with another example we'll see in our course later this semester. Vladimir Lenin, the leader of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, lived rather simply. He wasn't personally corrupt, and yet Lenin was a brutal individual who very happily, signed death warrants for many so-called political enemies. That's kind of Robespierre as well. So personally honest and yet willing to use violence in the defense of his beloved revolution. Well, Robespierre and the other members of the Committee of Public Safety. Remember, Robespierre is going to end up being only one of 9 members on the Committee of Public Safety. Maybe the most influential, but it was not, again, a one-man dictatorship. Robespierre and his inner circle are going to begin to institute in 1793 what we refer to as the Reign of Terror. The Reign of Terror is going to be in pursuit of so-called enemies, both inside and outside of France. Why did the Jacobins go after enemies? Well, the Jacobins may have been paranoid in the sense of seeing enemies everywhere, but to a certain degree, there were also enemies everywhere. After a while, the Jacobins began to make up enemies, began to charge people with treason who clearly were not traitors. But there were those who were in opposition to the French state, as it was currently being led by the Jacobins. Let's look at this, and you can see on this slide here, we could see some of the various elements that could be labeled as enemies of the French state. For example, throughout the Jacobin period, France remained at war. And in fact, the war was spreading. You had the War of the First Coalition, where Austria and Prussia are joined by Britain with its vast navy and economic resources, the Dutch, the Spanish. I mean, it becomes a European-wide coalition against France. So in that sense, are the Jacobins wrong to say we have enemies? No, they do have foreign enemies who are willing to go to war with France. Then you also have emigres. What's an emigre? An emigre is kind of the opposite of an immigrant. If you study American history, and you'll see that, the millions of individuals who came to this country, from our American perspective, they are immigrants. But what about the perspective of the country that they left? Let's say we were studying Irish history. And we talk about the fact that after the terrible Irish potato famine in 1846, around 1 million Irish men and women left the country. From the Irish perspective, they're not immigrants, they are emigres, those who left. France is going to have thousands who left or are emigres. Who are these emigres? For the most part, they're going to be members of the old nobility. By the time you get to the Jacobins, the nobility as a social class has been destroyed. Their privileges are now all gone. Aristocratic titles are now dropped. And from very early on in the revolution, thousands of emigres fled France, including Louis XVI's two younger brothers. Now, are the Jacobins wrong to see the emigres as enemies? Well, to a certain extent, they're not. These emigres, in many cases, are going to form armed groups and live on the borders of France and join with the Austrian and Prussian armies as they begin to fight against the forces of the French Revolution. So in that sense, the emigres are in opposition to the French state. Also, within France, you have counter-revolution or essentially civil war. I had already mentioned one example. You remember the Vendée region, where French peasants, often for religious reasons, were fighting against the French state. In the South, you also have, those who were supporters of the Girondins. You notice in this map, there's sort of a triangle, purplish shape. That's where you had that Federalist revolt. It's called the Federalist Revolt because the Girondins wanted a more federal-style government, like in the United States, where there'd be strong local control. And so again, is there, counter-revolution? Are Frenchmen fighting Frenchmen? Yes. Another reason for the Reign of Terror is going to be France at this time lacked what we'd call the notion of a loyal opposition. A loyal opposition is a kind of a complex political idea for societies to develop. Very often, there are countries that will have a democratic election. If you look at parts of the world in the aftermath of the Second World War, when, for example, European nations ended their imperialistic control over large parts of Africa and Asia, in many places you had, after independence, a free and democratic election. The problem's going to be, what happens when the party that won that first election eventually loses? And unfortunately, in many cases, the party in control refuses to accept that they lost and taint their opponents as traitors. That's a rather common thing you see in societies that fail to develop the notion of a loyal opposition. What do I mean by loyal opposition? The loyal opposition is the idea that you are opposed to my policies, but you are not a traitor. In Britain, for example, they use the term Her Majesty's government. So, for example, right now, the Conservative Party is in charge. Boris Johnson is the Prime Minister. That's Her Majesty's government. What about the Labor Party, which is the opposition party? They're given the very nice, polite title of Her Majesty's Opposition. Now, that doesn't mean they're in opposition to her, but Her Majesty's Opposition means they're also mine. They're in opposition to the current conservative government, but they're part of our political structure. So it's a nice way of phrasing that, yeah, they're in opposition to the current policies, but these are loyal citizens of the United Kingdom. You know, when we had a test of this in our own country, in 1800, we had an absolutely critical presidential election. You had a sitting president, John Adams, who was running for re-election against his former friend, now bitter enemy, Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson won. Well, did Adams then declare Jefferson and his supporters traitors and refuse to respect the election results? No. Jefferson became president. There was a peaceful transition of power. That's a very important idea in any society, the notion of a loyal, a free and fair opposition. France at this time did not have that. Robespierre, for example, had a set way of viewing how France should be governed. If you differed at all from that vision, you weren't opposition, you weren't someone who disagreed, you were a traitor. And if you see someone as a traitor, what you do with them could mean, ultimately death. Now, the Jacobins are going to say they are the ones who are being persecuted. And therefore, if they're inflicting violence, it's sort of self-defense. That was their way of viewing things. And they had a famous incident which they used to back up that sense that they were the ones who were being persecuted. It was an issue dealing with the murder of the man you see in that slide, a man by the name of Marat, Jean-Paul Marat. Who was Marat? Marat was an extremist journalist. He was a journalist who had a newspaper called The Friend of the People, and he had what you might call a poison pen. I don't mean literally like a James Bond movie where you have a pen that could kill someone. A poison pen is where you write things which could lead to, the death of someone else. You basically call someone a traitor. You say they should pay with their life for their crimes. That's what we call a poison pen. And Marat, who was not exactly a Jacobin, he was not directly associated with them, but was sort of associated with their policies quite often, used his poison pen to attack Girondins, calling them traitors, individuals who should pay with their lives. Well, what's going to happen is, in July of 1793, Marat was in his bathtub, and he was there for a reason. Earlier in the revolution, he was going to be arrested for incendiary, publishing that was violent, as the government called it, and he escaped by going through the sewers of Paris. By doing so, he picked up an awful skin disease, which left him in terrible pain. The only way he could get any physical relief was by sitting in a tub of water. And so essentially he fashioned in his home an office out of his bathtub. And so he would receive visitors in his tub with this wooden platform on top that he fashioned into a desk. And that's how he met Charlotte Corday. Corday is Corday. Charlotte Corday was a woman who was friends with a number of the Girondins who had been put to death. And she blamed Marat for his incendiary writing. She believed it was his writing which had led to their being charged with treason. So she asked to see the great journalist Marat. She went to his home, asked to see him, and when she was brought to his tub and with his writing platform, she took out a knife and stabbed him. Now, what comes of this incident? In many ways, Marat was far more useful to the Jacobins dead than alive, because Jacques-Louis David, the great artist of the revolution, who we've now encountered several times, created a masterpiece out of this incident. This is arguably the most important painting to emerge from the period of the French Revolution. It's a painting that sits in the Louvre Museum in Paris, never travels. It's too historically important to ever leave its spot in the Louvre. If you look at it, you see David reduces this event to its essentials. There is nothing in the background. Our attention is all on the prone body of Marat. He's there. You see a wound in the upper chest. He's laid out in a very Christ-like way. If you look at Christian art, you have the scenes of the Pieta, the sorrow, where Christ is taken down from the cross, and you see where a Roman soldier had pierced his flesh. None of this is accidental in this painting. Marat is being presented this way as a martyr, not as a Christian martyr, but as a martyr for the French Revolution. By the way, you'll notice that considering I just told you that Marat was sat in his tub all day because he had this terrible skin infection and needed water to bring some sort of soothing relief, if you look at this painting, his skin looks rather good. It's nice and clear. Why is that? Well, David understood that if you really showed Marat the way he was, with open sores, with pus and all that, it would be distracting from the essential message of the painting. We would look away in disgust if we actually saw this man in all his physical misery. And so essentially, Marat is painted in this pristine, clean manner to emphasize the story. The actual physical reality is not what matters. It is the story behind this, Marat's sacrifice for the revolution. Well, the Jacobins were continuing to have difficulties. If you remember from the previous map, I mentioned what was called the Federalist Revolt, where you had Girondins in the south of France fighting against the Jacobin regime. To make matters worse, the British Navy arrives in the port city at Toulon. You see in that blue map, it's pointing to a French port. That's the most important French port in the Mediterranean. And it was now held by Girondins with the support of the British. So things were looking rather difficult for the Jacobins. And so they began to ramp up their attacks on what they perceived to be illegal opposition. One of the things they introduced was what was called the law of suspects. The law of suspects simply allowed the French government to arrest anyone they even had the vaguest suspicion of being a traitor. So essentially you didn't even have to have proof. Pretty much the thought was, we need to sort of, find who is in opposition to this regime, who's not necessarily even actively fighting against this regime, but is just holding thoughts in opposition. As you can imagine, this kind of loosely phrased law could be used in the most, horrific manner, where anyone you wanted to charge, whether it was an honest charge or not, could just be brought before the Revolutionary Tribunal. The law of suspects allowed pretty much anyone to be caught in the web of the Jacobins, and it's going to really be kicking up a notch in terms of the violence. When we talk about the Reign of Terror, the most powerful symbol, the most horrific symbol, is going to be the infamous guillotine, which you see right here. The guillotine has a strange story behind it. It's not the story you may have heard. I remember first hearing the idea that there was a Dr. Guillotine who invented the device, and then ironically was one of the first people to be executed by it. That part's not true. There was a Dr. Guillotine who was elected representative to the Estates General in 1789. And early on, he gave a speech where he said, we need to find a more humane way to execute traitors. Now, that may be an oxymoron. Two words you put together, humane killing, humane execution. But his argument was traditionally, we executed traitors by beheading them with an axe. And yet, in French history, there's some terrible stories of these executions going very badly. You have a poorly trained executioner, or you have a blade that's not sharpened enough, or you have a victim who has a neck like a football player. And there's some awful incidents where executions were seen as just being absolutely horrific. So, oddly enough, Dr. Guillotine was taking an idea from the Enlightenment, the intellectual movement of the 18th century, which talked about not having physical violence against against a prisoner. They talked about humane treatment. It was in the 18th century where they began to talk about humane treatment towards animals. It was in the 18th century where they began to talk about ending the practice of whipping as a punishment in the British Navy. So keeping with that, he said, let's end the practice of beheading with an axe and find something better. And then that's where his story ends. He has no later role in this. The actual device is going to take a while to develop. They experimented it. Ultimately, they realized that a blade at an angle, dropped from a great height, effectively removed the head in one blow. And so the guillotine becomes the tool of the Reign of Terror. Now, ironically, since Guillotine talked about it as being humane, we know, of course, the guillotine is a brutal device. It was used in France up until the early 1950s. We know it's brutal because who else used the guillotine? Actually, the Nazis used it against political prisoners. They had a special tabletop model, much smaller, but it did the same job. So we know if the Nazis are using it, it's obviously the most brutal of tools. But yet guillotine wanted something where you would not need a second strike against the neck. I don't know how many of you have ever visited Madame Tussauds on 42nd Street. The Madame Tussauds on 42nd Street is part of I don't remember how many there are around the world. I think it's clearly around 8 or so in Japan, here in New York, Paris. The original one is actually, the original and best and biggest is in London. Who was Madame Tussauds? Madame Tussauds began to work with her uncle, who used to make death masks. Wealthy families in the 18th century would create a waxen image and then cast it in the aftermath of a family member's death. A practice you and I might find bizarre, but it was not unheard of in the 18th century. During the Reign of Terror, she began to go to where you had the bodies of those who were executed by the guillotine and began to look for the heads of famous Frenchmen. And she began to make wax molds of their heads and eventually set up a business in London. The image you're seeing in this photograph is not from the New York Madame Tussauds. That's much smaller. The one in London, though, because it has the additional space, has a section telling the history of Madame Tussauds, and that's where you see this, where here she is with her lamp in this place where bodies have been dumped, looking for some of the most famous victims of revolutionary murder. Well, while the guillotine may be the infamous symbol of the Reign of Terror, of the roughly 40,000 people who were executed at this time, the majority were not guillotined. Yes, the guillotine became the symbol. The guillotine was used for the most famous opponents of the Jacobin government. But the majority of individuals were not famous individuals. The majority of victims were peasants who were fighting against the Jacobin regime, usually over religious issues. For those individuals, the Jacobin government is going to send out what they call deputies on mission. Government officials from Paris, fits in with their centralized view of things, centralized figures sent out from Paris to the rest of the country, and they would organize the executions. And this painting, not a great work of art, but in this painting, you see one of the most common methods of execution implemented by these deputies on mission. They would put peasants on ships and then sink the ships, and the people on board, bound, with hands bound behind their back, would drown. So that's the way the majority of those who were executed during the Reign of Terror were executed. Now, the violence of the Jacobins was in part a reflection of the overall violence going on in Europe, as Europe is going to unite against the French revolutionary government. You have this War of the First Coalition, a war which had started badly. Then at Valmy, the French stopped the Austrians and Prussians temporarily. Then it swings against France during the Girondin period. The Girondins get the blame. Now the war is the Jacobins' baby. They're the ones who are responsible for it. And they come up with a way of addressing the manpower issue. How do we get enough soldiers to face this combined coalition? They develop what's called the levée en masse. You and I in English would call it a draft or universal conscription. Let's look at the famous words from this document. From this moment until that in which the enemy shall have been driven from the soil of the Republic, all Frenchmen are in permanent requisition for the service of the armies. The young men shall go to battle. The married men shall forge arms and transport provisions. The women shall make tents and clothing and shall serve in the hospitals. The children shall turn old linen into, basically what you're seeing here is everyone has a role in the service of the nation. If the Declaration of Rights of Man talked about rights for Frenchmen, this document is saying, along with rights as a citizen, you also have responsibilities. By the way, I like where it says, the young men shall go to battle, the married men shall forge arms and transport provisions. It means if you're married, you could stay home. How many guys, when they saw this pasted on a wall in their village, dropped down on one knee and proposed to their long-term girlfriend? It's like, okay, let's get married. I know you've been talking about it for a while. Let's do it now so I don't have to go fight. Anyway, what's significant about this document? It began to create much larger French armies. You're tapping into the vast population of France. It also begins to create motivated armies. Now, I'm not saying every soldier who went off with a song in his heart. But essentially, these are going to be soldiers who know what they're fighting for. What are they fighting for? They're fighting for their nation. They're fighting for France. The levée en masse is one of the stages in the development of a very important idea in modern Europe, the idea of nationalism, where your identity is with a nation, with a group of individuals living within a common border, often sharing the same language, similar culture. Nationalism becomes a very powerful idea in Europe, and the modern notion of nationalism begins with the French Revolution. We see it in a number of ways. A national army. This is not the king's army. This is an army that reflects the French people. Even the symbols of the nation. Before the French Revolution, there was no such thing as a national flag. What you had is that thing you see on the left there, what's called the fleur-de-lis, that white background, this gold sort of floral emblem. That was not a French flag. It was the banner of the Bourbon dynasty. It was the king's banner. And essentially, if you were fighting in a French army, it was really the king's army under the old regime. On the right, you have the famous tricolor, the flag of France. Now, this flag was adopted early on in the revolution, so it contains things that might have otherwise been dropped. In the center, you see it's white. Because early on, if you remember, France had a constitutional monarchy during the revolution, so the white reflects the banner of the old Bourbon dynasty. The blue was the color of those who supported revolution. Red was the color of the city of Paris. And so that's where the flag came from. And it's still used to this day. So it's a national flag. Even a national anthem. The famous anthem of France is called the Marseillaise. Well, that was a song, a marching song from soldiers from the French southern city of Marseille as they were marching off during the French Revolutionary Wars to fight against the Austrians and the Prussians. That became the national anthem. If you look at it today, you look at the translation in English, it's easy to find on the web, you'll see that it's a very, nationalistic, patriotic song calling on Frenchmen to fight against tyranny and to fight for freedom. Again, it's a strange thing. And I think I mentioned this in the first lecture. In 1750, if I had visited time travel to what you and I would call France, and I asked people what they were, no one would say they were French. No one. They would say, I'm Norman because I come from Normandy. I'm Provençal. Or they might talk about their family. No one would say they're French. After 1789, you begin to have the birth of a French identity. And of course, if you could develop a sense of being French, what's to stop those who are Italian from saying similar things, or Polish, or German, or Serbian? And so this idea of nationalism becomes one of the powerful ideologies to spread from France into the rest of Europe. One of the oddest things that the French Revolutionary government's going to introduce was a new calendar. The Jacobins introduced this in 1793, and these are the features of this new calendar. Instead of calling 1793, they called it year 2, which made, of course, 1792 year 1. Instead of having the months with different number of days, for example, 31 in some cases, 28 in the case of February, you would have 12 months of 30 days. If you do the math, you realize you have 5 days left over, 6 in a leap year. Those extra days were called the Sansculottides and were treated as a national holiday. Weeks were no longer 7 days. They were 10-day weeks, which angered workers because traditionally you had 1 day off in 7, Sunday. Now you had 1 day off in 10. And this new decree on the calendar created new months. And I posted them here: Vendemiaire, Brumaire, Frimaire. They're rather pretty names that reflect the seasons. Frimaire, for example, in the winter months, that it's cold. So the names are rather pretty and they reflect seasonal attributes. Why did the Jacobins introduce this calendar? Essentially for 2 reasons. On the one hand, it's a more rational calendar. The French Revolution is going to build up on one of the principles of the Enlightenment, and that is rationalism. Things need to make sense. You have to be able to justify them if you're going to do it. And this calendar is more rational. We all had to, in elementary school, memorize that poem, 30 Days, Half September, and I don't think I even know it to this day. But, as we're aware, certain months have 31, some have 30, and then oddball February is stuck with 28. This calendar, presented by the Jacobins, is more rational in that all the months are the same. So in that sense, rationalism plays a role. The main reason for this calendar, though, was it was an attack on the past. First of all, it was an attack on the Catholic Church. And it clearly was meant to be that. What's the most important Christian holiday? It's not Christmas, for those of you who guessed that. It's Easter, representing the resurrection of Christ. Where is that in this new calendar? You can't find it. Where is this Lenten season, the 40 days leading up to Easter? You can't find it. Where's Sunday? All those things have been erased, and they were not erased accidentally. This calendar was set up to make Catholic practice in France much more difficult, if not impossible, to uphold. So that's one thing. The other thing is it's an attack on the past in the sense of by calling year 1 1792, you're erasing what happened before. First of all, it's interesting that they chose 1792 as their year 1. What was another option? 1789, the year that revolution began. But if you recall, what was established in 1789? The constitutional monarchy. The Jacobins did not want to consider that now their year 1. They wanted to mark year 1 as the birth of the Republic, 1792. So it's kind of a way of also eliminating the past and saying we're starting a new world. By the way, you don't have to go to great efforts of memorizing this new calendar. The calendar will eventually disappear during the Napoleonic period. So it does not last that long in France. This calendar, though, as I emphasized, is part of an overall hostile attitude towards the Catholic Church. Basically, Catholic practices had to go underground. This is a painting from the mid-19th century showing how at times Catholic worship had, tried to continue under the most difficult of circumstances. Here you see in the center, a figure in white, a priest, celebrating the sacrament of the Mass. And the reason why it's being done on these boats is that it was to get away from snooping authorities. That if you could pretend you're going out to fish, it might be a way in which you could perform the Mass. Catholic services had to go underground. Among the 40,000 victims of the Reign of Terror, a significant number were in fact priests who were put to death for trying to continue to practice their faith. Now, the Jacobin government, while it was very hostile to the Catholic Church, did think about religious issues, and yet the Jacobin leadership was divided. Some Jacobins were very hostile to any form of a god. They rejected any notion. They were agnostic or atheists. And some of those individuals implemented what was called the Festival of Reason. They basically took Notre Dame, the great Gothic cathedral in the heart of Paris, put in a statue of a Greek god, or in this case, a Greek goddess, and then tried to create a kind of common belief around the notion of reason. We don't need a divine God. We don't need an all-knowing God. We can just focus on the notion of reason. So it was a atheistic sort of festival. Many in France were horrified by this Festival of Reason, including Robespierre, by the way. Robespierre hated atheism. Robespierre did not necessarily embrace traditional Catholic practice. He certainly didn't. But he believed that there was a God. He was what we might call a deist, D-E-I-S-T. Deism is the belief that there is a God, but this God has never revealed himself. Many of our own founding fathers, like Washington, Jefferson, Adams, were deists. They believed in a divine being who sort of set this world in motion. But then, as they would call it, the clockmaker stepped away from the clock. At no point was this God involved in our existence afterwards. And so Robespierre created an alternative faith to Catholicism, but one that didn't go as far as the Festival of Reason. He created what was called his cult of the Supreme Being, where they celebrated a deity, a God. But again, this is not the Christian God. In Christianity, you have a revealed God, a God who becomes man in the case of Christ. That's not what's being celebrated here. Now keep in mind the Jacobin attacks on the Catholic Church This festival of reason, this cult of supreme being, is going to divide Frenchmen. And it does provide one of the reasons for the eventual fall of the Jacobins. Many were horrified by their extreme anti-religious practices. Ultimately, the Jacobins begin to devour their own. The revolution's chewing up its own supporters. At first, the Jacobins go up against the Hébertists. Who are the Hébertists? Well, there was a man by the name of Hébert who was in many ways a radical socialist. The Jacobins were not. The Jacobins did talk about a law of maximum, capping grain prices, but they did not want to see the elimination of private property. The followers of Hébert believed in what we might call a more communistic system, the elimination of all private property. Initially, Hébert could be seen as a sort of on the extreme side of the Jacobins, but the Jacobin leadership is going to decide he is dangerous, he's plotting against us, and Hébert and his followers were guillotined. So basically, the Jacobin leadership under Robespierre destroyed those who were to their left, more radical than them. Robespierre is also going to destroy the right wing, the more conservative side of the Jacobin leadership. Georges Danton was a very important figure throughout the French Revolution. He was going to be a Jacobin supporter, for a while a close colleague to Robespierre. Danton has a great deal of blood on his hands. He was the one who was in charge of the French prisons during the September massacres, did nothing to stop the violence. He supported the creation of the Revolutionary Tribunal. He supported the creation of the law of suspects. But he eventually begins to say, we have basically done all the violence we needed to do. We don't need to go any further. We must stop the violence. Well, the problem is, if you're one of the individuals who initially called for the infliction of violence, it's rather difficult to be the one who says, okay, it's enough. On the right on this slide, you see his famous call for clemency, where he basically said, it's enough. The time for the guillotine is over. Robespierre is going to see that as an attack on his own leadership because Robespierre continued to call for revolutionary violence, and so Danton and his followers end up being put to death. Well, not surprisingly, Robespierre is creating more and more enemies. While he tries to squash enemies, he's also creating more. And that leads to a famous event in the month of Thermidor, one of those new months, or the exact date in our calendar was July 28th, 1794. What's going to happen is a supporter of Robespierre, a man by the name of Saint-Just, stood up before the National Convention, and the thought was he was going to read a new list of names of traitors. Periodically, the Jacobin Committee of Public Safety would read off a list of names, and sometimes those people were even sitting in the National Convention, and they'd be hauled off, and a day or so later, guillotine. For whatever reason, the thought among those in the National Convention was he was about to read a new list. And people in the convention were scared, terrified that they would be on that list. And so they shouted him down. Robespierre got up to speak, and again, Robespierre was shouted down. Well, the Jacobin leadership sort of shows timidity here. They don't know what to do. They head back to their headquarters, which at the time was the City Hall in Paris. That evening, a large crowd of individuals gathered and stormed the Jacobin headquarters. The Jacobin leadership was arrested. In this painting, you see Robespierre being shot in the jaw. They patched him up because they wanted him to die on the guillotine. The next day, Robespierre and other leading Jacobins were brought to the guillotine. Robespierre, whose jaw was bandaged in tape, because of the previous night's shooting, the tape was pulled, the bandage was pulled away from the jaw, and he let out a scream that they said was indescribable. He and his fellow Jacobin leaders were put to death. What does this mean for us? Well, Thermidor marks the end of the Jacobin Republic, the most extreme phase of the revolution. Thermidor has also come to mean something else. Thermidor has come to mean, in political thought, to mean counter-revolution. For example, again, later this semester, we'll talk about the Russian Revolution of 1917. Vladimir Lenin, the leader of the Communist Party, was constantly worried about what he himself called a possible Thermidor. What did he mean? It was shorthand for saying our radical revolution will come to an end because there will be counter-revolutionaries who push us aside. And he was constantly on the watch for that. Again, the term Thermidor comes from this, where more moderate opponents of the Jacobins, those who began to fear for their own life, decided the Jacobins had to go. Well, what happens now that the most radical phase of our revolution has come to an end? We get to our next phase, the phase known as the Directory. This is going to be the last phase of our republic. The Directory gets its name because there were 5 chief executives. In our country, our chief executive is the president, a singular political office. In France, the Directory was going to be 5 individuals. The Directory was in many ways a more moderate government than the Jacobins. I'll give you an example of this. During the Jacobin period, all men were allowed to vote. The distinction between active and passive citizens was removed. Under the Directory, once again, full-fledged citizenship was only granted to those who earned enough money to pay taxes that allowed to hold political office and to vote. That's a more conservative approach than the Jacobins. During the Directory, fancy parties came back. See, under the Jacobins, you were supposed to show strict Republican virtue. You wore simple garments. You didn't wear jewelry. Here, as you could see in this drawing, again, it's a British cartoon. It's showing the fancy dress, mocking it, that began to reappear during the Directory. See, the Directory is going to be dominated by a new type of leadership. Not the old elite prior to the French Revolution, which was based on birth. No, this was an elite of people who were making money from the French Revolution in many cases. Sometimes they were mockingly called the muscadins. Muscadins meaning those who wore musk perfume, a musk-based perfume. They wore fancy clothes, and in many cases, these were men and women who came from families who had profited off of the French Revolution. They provided equipment for the armies. They provided food. They had the contracts that made them the new economic elite of this regime. Well, the Directory is going to last until 1799. It's ultimately going to be overthrown by this man, Napoleon Bonaparte, and he'll be the subject of our next lecture.